This is Exception to Rule, the Why of Try and Die, about error handling in Perl. I am Bruce Gray. I go by Util online, IRC and Perl Monks. I'm involved with Parrot and Perl 6. And last year, I gave a talk, an experimental talk, called The Why of My, and it was based on trying to teach something that people keep learning and relearning and relearning, and it doesn't stick in their heads. I'm trying to teach that from a historical perspective. And it was experimental, but that seemed to be the way to go, and it worked out splendidly. People were saying, yes, that's the way, I'm going to be teaching that from now on. So I was real happy about that. This year, I'm taking a different tact with the history. It is the history of my brain as it tried to come to grips with an unwelcome truth that exceptions should be used instead of returned errors. Like last year, I want to tell you that I am not a historian, I am a storyteller. So where it makes for a better story, I will lie to you. The basics in the first half are for beginners, not complete beginners. I don't cover like what an exception is. I realized a minute ago that that might be an oversight. And the advanced stuff in the last half is what I think we can do to get the community to embrace this, this concept of using exceptions instead of return codes, because several other people have tried and it doesn't seem to be sinking in. So, my tug of war. I came from languages like, hi, sure, and good to see you. I came from languages like RPG and BASIC and C before I ever met Perl. And I worked with C, but I taught myself, and I didn't use it in a commercial environment, so I never heard about set jump or long jump. BASIC, on error, or whatever version of BASIC you're using, really mysterious and a little bit beyond me. RPG, oh my God! If you get an error in the middle of an RPG program, it will ask the user who does not have access to your source code. It says, such and such an error on line whatever, what would you like to do? Would you like to skip this record and go to the next one? Would you like to bypass that divide by zero and act like it didn't happen? Would you like to dump every variable in your program, including all the security information, to the printer? It was all a dark art, how to do error handling in these languages. They did have exceptions of a kind, but it all went to someplace way distant, usually an error handler for your entire program rather than for a section of your program, and how you would pass information to the error handler to know exactly what it's supposed to be doing. It was just very under-discussed in the industry, in anything I had access to. And then I came to Perl. Perl has error handling like this. Have you ever seen anything as beautiful? Ah, I was in heaven. And then Damien Conway released Perl Best Practices, which I took to heart. There was a ton of stuff in there that was very helpful. I disagreed with about 10% of the book. Everybody disagrees with about 10% of the book. It's a different 10% for each person. Everything I disagreed on, I had good reason for, except one thing. He said use exceptions instead of returned errors. And I disagreed, but I could not articulate why. And it started bothering me when I was writing code in the shower every day. My brain would get pulled off of code and onto this thing. I respect Damien. Why can't I take his advice on this? So I went back to the staples, learning Perl, programming Perl. Essentially no mentions of exceptions. All right, but Damien talks about the inconsistent error APIs. I look close at that. Yeah, it's really disturbing. Some modules return false. Those are inconsistent on where they return the data of the error. Some things like LWP, you check for success at the end of everything, and if you think that you're dealing with return false, you will write terribly buggy code. And then if you're handling exceptions, then you have $at, which is so easy to remember. And then I learned XML. XML has this thing in its standard that says if it's not well formed, it's not XML, and you have to immediately quit parsing it. So I thought, I've got a lot of XML on this Windows hard drive. I'm going to scan for every XML file and run it through XML parser and see what it fails on. So that code looked something like that. It's a simple one-liner. I had gathered everything in xml.lst, and it for every program, it loads a new parser, it tries to parse the file, and if it fails, then it prints a list. Now, that was an old system, and I had a lot of files, so I let that run overnight. Anybody know what happened? Yeah, the XML parser follows the standard very strictly, which says as soon as you detect that something's not working, you cannot go on. And it does that by dying. The module throws die. And I was ready to punch a hole in something. I was so outraged. It was beyond me. I did not know about eval. I did not know about capturing errors. I had not gotten to that part of the documentation, and had not been led there by the books that had taken me through Perl. It was just outrageous to think that this would be part of the API of the module. It's like putting exit in code. You know, to me, there's no way to recover from it. It's fine if you want to just be processing one thing of XML to say, all right, we're going to die on that. But for a CPAN module to force that death on me, the user of the module, I was just at a complete loss. I was outraged. Several days later, I did find eval. I didn't put two and two together into exceptions there, but I did know how to handle something that did die. But it was repellent. So now Damien's idea is further from me. I mean, this if that's how exceptions work, it's completely evil. But trying to recover from that XML problem, trying to solve it, I looked heavily, deeply in the documentation. And I found things like this. The docs on eval. Note the second half. It's that doesn't inspire confidence in me. That's die. And while that doesn't uninspire me, it does not tell me that there are two completely different worlds of error handling, and here's one of them, and giving equal weight, here's another. It's just like, oh yeah, if you want to do that, this is how. And that's all the detail on how you can throw an exception with an object, which is much more powerful and much better than a string exception, but you don't get the sense of why. There's no, I don't expect to have my hand held, but there's no guidance at all to shape anybody reading it into how you would use that day to day. And I did finally find where I was supposed to read about exception handling. It's in PerlFac 8 under the question, how do I do a set jump or long jump? I only found that while researching this talk. The docs are actually quite discouraging. This is Perl mod style, the document on what style you should write your modules in. And it says you should do one of these things, including throw an exception. And you might want to use the error module, error.pm, to throw an exception. That's the documentation. Oh, that was 5.18 that I just got that off of. Here's the error.pm. So,
the previous document did say you might want to use it.
yeah. So then I found out about try-catch and fatal. So, all right, yeah, give that a chance. No, try-catch is really heavy. Fatal doesn't work in a lexical scope, so you're turning it on for your program and all the modules that your program uses, and that's not a good interaction. But I got to give them another chance. I mean, the stuff I came from that I had such a horrible experience with exceptions in, those are ancient. Let's look at some more modern things. C++ exception. No, I'm not going to look at anything that does C out for output. No respect. Java exceptions. Okay, all right. Huge boilerplate. A lot of the boilerplate goes to swallowing exceptions. So people are cut and pasting cargo cult style stuff from books and things online that swallow the exceptions and cause silent failure. And as a prescription goes, that'd be like take 2 aspirin and in the morning, kill yourself. And then Bruce Eckel, who wrote Thinking in Java, published an article that Java's exceptions, in his opinion, and several other respected members of their community's opinion, were a mistake. Except I misunderstood that when they said it. That's not exactly what they meant. They meant that checked exceptions were a mistake, not that exceptions were bad, just Java's particular implementation of it. I agree with them. So then I saw some YAPC talks, early ones contained pieces about exceptions. Later ones were specifically on things like exception class and try-tiny. All the cool kids were using it. So I'll give it another chance. Except I wasn't really working in OO that much in Perl at the time, and exception class is how you get the object exceptions. And without that, you got to do O to do that, and it's just, no, all right, too much trouble. And then Perl 6, the specs said that they were going to change most of the things that return errors in Perl 5 to throw exceptions instead. Not only that, behind the scenes, they were going to be using exceptions for all kinds of stuff. Like if you do a next, like to get the next thing in a for loop, behind the scenes, it throws a special kind of exception that the for loop intercepts. It says it's not an error, I'm supposed to do something. It's all through the control flow. So I've got to give serious thought to this. I mean, these are big brains thinking about Perl 6, but the spec was still in flux then. They kept changing their mind about stuff. And so I had to hold out for the possibility that they were going to change their minds about that. They would come to their senses because, you know, you've seen everything my brain's going through. It's junk. Perl monks should have been my wake-up call. I spent a lot of time on Perl monks trying to help people. It's difficult. People come and ask a particular question and show you code. And you want to say, well, before that, you need to do these other things that you're you're shooting yourself in the foot. And if you do that, then they'll get mad because you didn't answer their question. So we've developed this way of answering the question and then posting how we would write that code so we have an opportunity to point out the other things that they should be doing that they learned from a bad book or a bad teacher or whatever. And you don't want to pass up the opportunity to pass that on. So what's the first thing that we tell those people? What's the first thing that people miss that you go, you got to do that? Use strict. Thank you. And after that, use warnings. And I would have said that that's the end of the list. But if I look back at what I actually recommend to people, there is a third thing. They'll write open whatever, semicolon. I have a standard thing in code review. Comment, or what? Open or what? Because if you don't say or something, then you get a silent failure. Then came what did work as my wake-up call. I work in software archaeology. No, I'm sorry, software archaeology. And Mike from Atlanta Perlmongers had been writing code for a new client for months, as fast as he could type. He's a great programmer. He was just really busy. And he hit a point where his structure, his design was getting in the way of adding new code. He wanted to add something that was much more difficult than what he had written so far, and he could not get it to work with the old code. So he asked me to come in and use my body of knowledge to refactor the existing code, like extract all the stuff into template toolkit and make objects out of things, and then add on the difficult part, which was a directed acyclical graph. And what I found in the code is what woke me up. They had routines that wrapped DBI that if it detected a problem, it set a global variable that you had to test for whenever you called that subroutine to know whether it had failed. And that routine would get called by something else that maintained its own error state and had to check this thing's error. And if it found an error there, then it had to manually establish its error string and return that up the stack. So you get 5 deep of these calls that everything's manually managing the errors. And if you miss anything ever, if any one of those does not check for the error, then you get silent failure, which with a website could mean that a customer's order goes away. What you want to do, and what happened at the top level of all these, is you die. Yeah, sure, you don't want your website to show death to a client. You can wrap that. But if you're going to do all that, if you almost never are handling the error with anything but die, why don't you die at the base level? So on the left is the kind of code that that scheme I just described delivered. And on the right is the equivalent if you are using exceptions. You just die. If you use, I didn't put the module name in there, params validate, then you can shortcut. This is a different set of code, and it gets even shorter because the validation of parameters, if it's not a valid parameter, it throws an exception. So that's a great fit with exception handling. How much code do you really want to write? So if you missed in there resetting the error string, then you essentially have an exception unhandler. If you miss checking for error, you get silent failure. Early in my career, I thought, I need to do whatever is necessary to keep a program from blowing up, because blowing up puts egg on my department's face. You want the executive to get their report. You want the nurse to get her patient care information. You want the website to not throw a numerical error at a customer. And that was completely wrong thinking. It is nearly always better to die than to give the wrong answer. If whatever was going to kill your program, that you just let it ignore the fact that, there's another division who's not on the lookup table. Therefore, their information does not get pulled into the report, and the total amount of revenue for the year is reported $1 million under what it actually was. The guy who reads that report would probably yell at your department if you didn't get it on time, but if you give it to him with the wrong answer, he's going to make the wrong decision based on that. I wrote a program that was used just for statistical stuff for a hospital, except that those statistics are used to justify whether the hospital gets what's called a certificate of need, whether another hospital gets to open next door. Things like that has to be auditable. If the audit trail ever failed, the program needed to fail because it doesn't matter if it's 2 a.m, it needed attention. And, you don't want a website user to see a problem, but it's better than he thinks he made an order and then he's got to call you in a week because you've never heard of it. What does that slide say? There are rare exceptions, but you should know where they are. They are exceedingly rare. Okay, let's go through the Stargate to an alternate universe for a moment. On the left is our universe, where open returns non-zero on success and undef on failure. On the right is an alternate universe, where Larry was hit in the head and designed it to just succeed, doesn't return anything, but if it fails, it'll throw an exception. It will try to die. The code, if you want to die on error, you're all familiar with open or die. By the way, don't actually do this. For size, I had to use global file handles and 2-argument open. You should be using lexical file handles and 3-argument open. If you don't know what that means, ask me during a break, please. So open or die. On the right, open, shorter. What if you want to ignore the error, which sometimes you do? Sometimes you're going to open it and you don't care. Rarer, but sometimes. Like this, like that. Same length, right? No, not really. On the left, a bare open will fail every code review. Anybody who's reviewing your code, it's a red flag because it's almost always a mistake when you see it in the wild. If you actually want to do that, you have to pair it with a comment explaining why you did it, or at least that it was intentional. Damien calls it a lack of syntactic markers. And it's a problem. You know, in real use, it's a red flag. So really, Stargate universe, still shorter. All right, what if you want to handle the error? You actually want to do something with it. So I've got a loop. We're going to walk through the files. We're going to look for the first one that we can open. On the left, try to open it. I'm using or do so that I can put multiple error handling statements in essentially one statement. That's what a do does. It makes a statement, one statement out of multiple. I'm going to log the error and go to the next one. And then if it doesn't fail, then it'll hit last and jump out. And then at the bottom is a clever version, shorter, harder to understand. Your maintenance programmer might kill you. The alternate universe is roughly the same as the long version on the left. It can't get as short as the clever version, but just like here in the red, you can't really do that. You can really do this, but probably you don't, because probably you want to make some distinction between the file's not there and the file is there, but I don't have authority to open it. If you're trying to get the first one that's there, then the first is a normal condition, it being absent. The second is probably something that you need to know about. So if you really want to handle the error, then this is what you get. You can't have a clever version anymore. And depending on what module you're using for try and catch, the one on the right is equivalent to or a little bit better than the one on the left. The same number of lines, but there's actually less that you have to put in there on the right. So the two modules that do that try and catch syntax are try tiny and try catch. Try catch is really nice. It's got wonderful syntax, nearly Perl 6 level syntax for it. But the dependencies are atrocious. And because of that, it is less used. You see the numbers there. 64 versus 0, 22 versus 578. So even though you don't get quite as good syntax with try tiny, that is probably what you should start with. So summarizing the stuff from before, Stargate's the winner. The alternate universe is would be a better place to code in. And summarizing the two worlds, the two concepts of error handling, returning an error versus exceptions. Returning an error, the minimal amount of code, just open, period, usually does the wrong thing. If you want to do the right thing, you have to write more code. So it is gently nudging every programmer, every Perl programmer in the world, every time that you use something that returns an error, gently nudging you towards failure. With exceptions, the least code gives you the behavior that you usually want. And yes, you do have to add more code to get handling of an error, but actually you don't usually want to handle the error. You want the error to propagate. You want it to blow up your program. So that doesn't require any nudging you towards success. Success is already the path of least resistance. That Stargate universe is available, has been since what, 5.12 in the core? Maybe I'm misremembering, but auto die. AutoDie is available separately on CPAN. You can probably import it for earlier Perls too. AutoDie converts basically every I/O system call, open, read, print, all those to away from or die kinds of return codes to throw an exception, and they're object exception objects, so you can look for particular classes of them and handle them in a sane, clean way. Now, I had hoped for an intermediate level. Remember I said there's a beginning and advanced. There's an intermediate here. I'd hoped to have some really cool stuff to talk about, like what should be your philosophy and what are some techniques to convert existing code. What happens if you are having to mix and match, some of the things that are being used by your program, throw exceptions, other things have return codes. What should you do about that? I wanted to talk about the dual APIs that things like DBI offer, where you can set in the DBI object whether you want it to raise an error, that is, throw an exception or not. And I even had some code I was working on that would automatically wrap return codes and throw exceptions instead, or wrap exceptions and throw return codes. But I did not have room in the margins to write it all out. But I will tell you one intermediate story, cautionary. As I'm giving this talk, over in the other building, Joe McMahon is giving another talk. I hope that the live feed works out because I really wanted to see it. And he tells the story of www Mechanize 1.4901. I won't steal his slides. Suffice it to say that after Mechanize was a wildly successful module, the authors decided we really should have done this from the beginning. We really should have thrown an exception if you don't check for errors. So we're going to change the module to automatically do that, automatically breaking a lot of people's code who had already deployed it. It was better. It was absolutely a better thing for everybody who had never used the module, who used the module from there on. But it caused problems for everybody before that, everybody who's already using the module. Your error handling is as much a part of your API as what order your parameters are in for any given subroutine or method call in a published module. You cannot just blanketly change it. It's important. It's not so important that you ought to have the compiler fail on it like Java does, but it's really important. So, we're having trouble getting this idea across. We can talk about it, and it doesn't seem to be sticking. So I wanted to look at why that might be. What are the attractors? What are the things that are pulling us towards returned errors so much that exceptions won't stick in our heads? Well, there's some great design elements that are just a perfect fit for returning error codes. We have or and. They short circuit and they're low precedence, which means you can essentially put anything on the left of an or, and if it fails, then whatever happens on the right of the or runs. So you can say whatever might fail or however you want to handle it. And as I said back in Fields of Joy, that is wonderful. There's undef. So many languages hit problems with, we can't use these return codes. We can't use, we're going to use -1 for a return code everywhere. Everywhere. If it returns -1, that means it failed. That happens everywhere in C. And that works great until one of your functions has a legitimate value of -1. And then everything that has that, it has a different API. You have to handle it differently. You have to look at them in the manual every time that you not only write these things that are the exceptions, but write anything, because you can no longer rely on everything following the rule. We have undef. Undef is pretty much guaranteed not to be a valid value. So just if you're going to fail, return undef, and that'll indicate failure. You're perfectly fine that 0 is a valid value because you have undef, except that if you're working with DBI stuff, undef represents a null, so it actually can be a valid value. Also, or does not check for definedness, it checks for truth, and 0, there's a whole class of bugs about that. Do, if you cannot handle an error in a single line, you can use whatever or do, and then do as much error handling as you want. So those are language elements that are attractors to error codes. The documentation, there's this, the docs, as I showed before, don't give equal weight to return code handling and exception handling. There is the Perlishness, like, are you speaking Perl, or are you speaking Perl like people who develop in Perl speak Perl, or are you writing in a C accent, or a Java accent? The Perlish way to do things is the or die, and that it's just a cultural thing. And finally, if you are going to write a CPAN module and you're trying to decide what API to use, exceptions or returned errors, if you want to use exceptions, how are you going to document the use of your module? The part at the top says, this is how you use it, some example code. You can't even do that decently without saying use try tiny or use try catch or something that isn't in core. And the if, eval and if $@, that's just so out there. I never remember it, I never use it, and you can't legitimately put it in documentation. So I was despairing. I thought that I was going to give this talk and that there was no hope. I'd have to say that the attractors are too strong. And that while all of you may get convinced to use exceptions, as a community, we're never going to get there. But then, this all came out of Perl best practices, you remember. So I asked Damien. I said, it's been a while. Have you changed your mind on anything? Have you given any other thoughts on exception handling? Even strengthened your position? And Damien said he had actually last year revisited the entire book, thought about every single thing in the book, and of course that included exception handling. And he sent me a copy of the exception handling chapter. I was happy that he had come to a lot of the same conclusions that I had, or that I had to same as him. But something I had not remotely thought of, he said that his original advice in recommending exceptions actually forces a policy decision that ought to be the decision of the user. A module should not necessarily say, I'm going to be returning error codes, or I'm going to be throwing exceptions. Whoever's using that module should be able to set it, similar to how DBI does. But that's a lot of code to expect every single author to implement in every single CPAN module. So I haven't seen it. I don't know if it works within a CPAN module. I don't know if it works within user code. But he said that at OSCON, he's plans to deploy, announce, demonstrate his new module, lexical failure, which will in some way allow you to have that control. And I was no longer despairing. Before I wrap up, any questions or any answers? And if you can't think of anything on the spot, I will be around during the conference. Feel free to grab me in the halls. Especially if you disagreed with me. I know some of this is a little contentious and not everybody here is convinced. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. But if you have a well-articulated position contrary to what I've said, I would love to hear it. Please come see me. Since I've got, yes.
I've been wanting to move to exceptions. I come from a Java world, so I'm more used to them. And for the reasons that don't like the error return codes. And I've looked at both try catch and try tiny and didn't like try catch because of the heaviness of it. And try tiny I didn't like because of the returning from within the catch block. I often run into situations where I want to return from within the catch block and exit the subroutine, or exit the subroutine, and it gets captured. So do you have any suggestions on how to deal with that, or if I'm trying to return from the catch block, do I have the wrong mindset?
For the people who are on live stream, the question is, she comes from a Java world, she wants to do exceptions, try catch is too heavy, try tiny has this weird thing about returns within a catch block, and it is a weird thing. I saw that. I don't think you have the wrong mindset about it. I think that it's implementation detail that was difficult to work around, so that's the way it is. And because that's the way it is, that's the way it's probably going to be, even if they do figure out how to do it differently. But I'm going to be encouraging that with all the Moose stuff that's going to be moving into core, that something about exceptions moves into the core, and that implementation won't have as many limitations as the try-tiny module. So if you want to be a proponent and maybe even volunteer some time to make that work in Perl 5.20, then that would be a benefit to us all. I'm sorry not to have a better answer, but I think you have to grin and bear it. There, in the documentation, in some non-intuitive place, it does discuss a couple of weird things to handle them, and they're kind of ugly, but you may find them not quite as ugly as what you just described. So, yeah. What else? I have glare, so if somebody's waving their hand, I can't see them. All right. The only thing I'll say about Java, because I am about in 30 seconds be over, don't let Java's exceptions and all the things you see about Java's exceptions that are fairly horrific influence you in deciding about Perl exceptions. They made a mistake. They decided to make exceptions part of the enforced signature of the API of methods, and that means that you have to handle stuff that you should not have to worry about. Lots of boilerplate code. Special thanks to the Atlanta Perl mongers who had to endure a 2-hour, one-slide version of this talk. Thanks also to my grandchildren for inspiration. The PDF that I have online, it's linked from the talk description now, has the modules I discussed, and I will be updating it if anybody finds any bugs or I have other ideas. Thank you.